Fountain Valley School. And let's give a particular welcome. Today we have, I think, 10 students, 9 or 10 students from Fountain Valley School. We are thrilled to have them. So I'll keep it short today. I'm going to invite Sky Forrester to the microphone to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Karen. And I'm going to keep mine short too, because you're really get ready for a treat. Steve Sokol is president of the American Council in Germany. He'll tell you more about that, but it's a nonprofit organization based in New York, promoting on every level, not just government policy, but on every level, better relations between the United States and Germany. And Steve and I were talking last night, and we share a view that this is it's not the same as the U.S.-British special relationship, but it is, to borrow Steve's word, an indispensable relationship. He took that job in May of 2015, and previously, in 2002, he was the vice president and director of programs at the American Council in Germany. And that's a period where I got to know Steve because he was often in Pittsburgh visiting the Pittsburgh chapter, and we shared a board chair in the late David Murdoch. And in that interim period of 5 years, between 2010 and 2015, that's when I left Pittsburgh as the World Affairs Council Pittsburgh president, and actively recruited Steve to be my successor. And he was indeed my successor for 5 years in Pittsburgh, and did a superb job as president of the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh, and served on the national board of the World Affairs Councils of America. All of which is to say, he knows what we're about. Steve is, I was going to tell some stories, but I won't. Steve grew up in England. He has worked through much of his professional life and his studies in Germany for well over a decade. He was deputy director of the Aspen Institute in Berlin. He was head of the project management department in Bonn at the Bonn International Center. He was a program officer in the Berlin office of the German Marshall Fund. And then, of course, when he wasn't working in Germany, except for a small interlude with the World Affairs Council, his jobs have been focused on U.S.-German relations. His bachelor's degree is from Wesleyan University. His master's in international relations and international economics from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Service. He studied at the Ruprecht-Karls Universität in Heidelberg. He was a Fulbright scholar at the Freie Universität in Berlin, and most recently a PhD in law and policy from Northeastern University. The one thing I will end by saying is, as I said last night, my own field and my own doctoral work was on U.S.-German relations, and I've known a lot of people who know a lot about Germany. But I cannot think of anyone in this country who knows more about German-American relations and the different levels in which that relationship rests than Steve Sokol. And with that, here's my friend Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sky. Thank you very much. And Karen, thank you for the invitation. You know, when I was running the World Affairs Council in Pittsburgh, we would always get, or try to get, some big name speaker to come when we had our annual meeting to try to get a good turnout for the annual meeting. But I'm happy to see that you're doing it the other way around here, because I'm sure that you all came for the annual meeting and all the business that you had, and not necessarily to hear from me. But it really is a great honor to be here, and anybody who knows Sky Forrester knows that it's very hard to turn them down. Sky wanted me to come out a while ago, and it took a couple of attempts for me to get here, but I could not be happier to be with you today and to be talking with you about Germany, a country that is near and dear to me. But I do have to say that when I went to Pittsburgh to take over from Sky and run the World Affairs Council, it was partly because I didn't want to be the Germany guy anymore. I had all of these sort of stops in my career that always led to Germany, and much of the work that I did had to do with issues beyond Germany and the German-American relationship. But I knew that if I worked for organizations like the German Marshall Fund or Aspen Institute Germany or the American Council on Germany, people would always say, oh, you're the Germany guy. And when I went to the World Affairs Council, while I was still interested in Germany, it was really a great opportunity to do programming on the rest of the world, and to do that programming across generations. And so I'm really happy that there are students from Fountain Valley here today, because I think that so much of the work that the councils do is, of course, to talk about sort of the standard high-level foreign policy issues that affect us all, but also to engage what I call the successor generation, right? The next generation of decision makers. And at the end of the day, to have a better educated and informed public when it comes to international affairs. So kudos to everything that you're doing here in Colorado Springs. And I have to say that my affiliation with the World Affairs Councils of America and the World Affairs Councils in general has been nothing short of incredibly rewarding. And it's just been a great opportunity for me. So Sky, you left this sort of opening for me to say a few words about the American Council on Germany, and maybe I'll do that. How many of you are familiar with the ACG? Okay, so half a dozen hands. If I were in New York, I'd say, where have you been, right? Why don't you know about the ACG? The ACG was created in 1952 by a group of people like John McCloy and Lucius Clay, who played a very important role in post-war reconstruction in Germany, and who had the foresight to say we need to change the Deutschland bit. We need to change the image of Germany in the United States, and we need to develop stronger economic tools after the first half of the 20th century. And I joke with people sometimes and say, on a good day, we're a think tank. On a bad day, we're glorified event planners. The reality is somewhere in the middle. And I think, Karen, you might appreciate this, right? It's all about engagement. It's all about convening power. It's all about bringing people together who wouldn't meet under other circumstances to talk about important issues, in my case, shaping the German-American and the transatlantic relationship. And so in our programming, whether it's in New York or in the 20 chapter cities we have across the US, including in Denver, or with the pandemic, whether it's online, we are constantly hosting policy discussions about domestic German politics, about developments in Europe, about the transatlantic partnership, and basically focusing on the most important, the most pressing economic, political, and social issues of the day. And so if I can put in sort of a quick plug, if any of you are interested in participating in our online programming, let me know. Reach out to our website. If you Google American Council on Germany, you will find it. But one thing that has become incredibly popular coming out of the pandemic is every Monday morning at 7 a.m. Colorado time, I check in with a journalist based in Berlin to measure the pulse of what's going on in contemporary Germany. And actually on Monday, I'll be speaking with Stephen Erlanger from the New York Times, who's now based in Berlin. He's the chief diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times, and he and I will be talking. I know it's a little early, 7 a.m., but for any of you that are interested, please tune in. We also release that as a podcast later in the day. So when it comes to Germany, there are lots and lots of different things to talk about, and I'm hoping that in the discussion we'll have a chance to cover some of those topics. But I was asked to talk about the current foreign and security policy that Germany is demonstrating, and so that's the lens that I'll use for my remarks. But as I said in the discussion, I hope we can sort of go off of that and talk about some other things as well. So 2 years ago, almost exactly 2 years ago, in late September of 2021, the so-called Ampelkoalition, traffic light coalition of social democrats, who are red, Greens, Green Party, and the liberal Free Democrats, who are yellow, right? That's how the traffic light coalition got its name, was elected. And these three coalition partners had pretty extensive negotiations from the end of September until the middle of December, where they came up with a coalition agreement of how they were going to work together for the next 4 years. And they came into office with what they called a change agenda. Actually, the motto of this new government was Mehr Fortschritt wagen. How many of you speak German? I'm assuming not that many, but a few. Okay, so Mehr Fortschritt wagen basically means dare to make changes, dare to be progressive. But this government also came in with an incredibly steep learning curve. And in terms of German history, this was the first time that there was a three-party coalition heading the government. It was the first time that there were 7 parties represented in the Bundestag, so some real sort of splintering in terms of the political landscape. And it was clear that the new German chancellor, Olaf Scholz, who took over after 16 years of Angela Merkel's leadership, would be challenged to keep his government together with the 3 parties, but also because within 2 of those parties, the Social Democrats and the Green parties, there are some stark divisions, there are some stark differences. In both cases, you have a more progressive group called the Fundis, and a more sort of rational centrist group called the Realos. And we're seeing some signs of strain in the government when you think about these 5 different factions that are represented in this 3-party coalition. And we can talk a little bit about that during the discussion. But the coalition agreement, and this is one of the things that's always impressed me about German politics, is the coalition agreement provided a roadmap, provided a guide for how these 3 parties were going to work together for at least the first 3 years, if not the full 4 years of their time in office. And they had a pretty ambitious agenda. But that ended up being fairly short-lived because, as we all know, on February 24th of 2022, so literally just 2.5 months after this government formed, Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. And Chancellor Scholz showed a real decisive response when 3 days later, on the 27th of February, he held a speech which has been called his Zeitenwende speech. This speech has largely been regarded as a real break with Germany's culture of restraint. Immediately after he gave this speech, which came as a surprise to many members of the Bundestag, including in his own party, Chancellor Scholz's polling ratings soared, and his speech has been referred to countless times because of the significance of change that it brought about. It meant a change in foreign policy, it meant a change in security policy, and it meant a big change in energy policy. And it was a fundamental recognition that the world would not be the same after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Some of the key aspects that he addressed in this speech had to do with support for Ukraine, had to do with a reduced energy dependence on Russia, a strong stance toward authoritarian states, not just Russia, but China as well. It also included a renewed commitment to NATO and the modernization of the German military, the Bundeswehr. In short, I think it's fair to say that the war in Ukraine has forced Germany to act rather than react when it comes to foreign policy. And Germany has certainly made some incredible steps over the last 18 months. But there are lots of questions that still abound about whether Germany will live up to the promises that were outlined in Chancellor Scholz's Zeitenwende speech. The government is doing a lot, and I'll get into some of the things that they're doing, but it's sort of stumbling around a little bit as it tries to navigate where Berlin sits and where Germany sits in the international arena. And so in broad brush strokes, I'd like to touch on 5 different things. The first is Germany's energy transition. The second is German support for Ukraine. The third is NATO and the Bundeswehr. The fourth is relations with Russia. And the last one is the framework for Germany's new foreign and security policy. So let me start with the energy transition, the energy transformation. One has to give Berlin a lot of credit because Germany, in the space of 9 months, cut its dependence on Russian oil and gas and made massive commitments to renewables. even before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the government was determined to dedicate considerable efforts to climate and energy reforms. Its aim was to accelerate the growth of renewables, to ramp up the use of hydrogen and do new research in the field of hydrogen, but also to reduce carbon emissions through heating systems and transportation systems, and to expand the power grid. The war gave a new impetus to something called Germany's Energiewende, or energy transition, which is something that even Chancellor Merkel had been focused on. And the goals were outlined in the coalition agreement. This was really one of the cornerstones of the coalition agreement. And the war, in a sort of ironic way, forced Germany to really jumpstart its movement in this direction. The big irony, and some of us were talking about this a little bit last night, is that in the short term at least, Germany has increased its reliance on coal and fossil fuels to power the economy because it had been so dependent on oil and gas from Russia. But in 2022, as I said, in the space of 9 months, Germany reduced its import of Russian gas from 55% of its overall gas use and oil from 40% of its overall oil use to nothing. By the end of 2022, they were not importing any energy from Russia. It also built 3 LNG terminals in record time. This was after months, if not years, of sort of waffling about investing in LNG and whether it made sense given the renewable focus that Germany has had. And it was interesting because Olaf Scholz talked about Deutschlandgeschwindigkeit, right? German speed in the way in which Germany built these LNG terminals. And some of the LNG that they're importing, they're now importing from the US. Due to energy concerns, the anti-nuclear power Green Party even supported keeping the 3 remaining nuclear power plants online until mid-April, even though they were supposed to be decommissioned at the end of last year. And so those did not get phased out as quickly, but there certainly was a debate also about keeping them online for even longer than that. But the government basically decided, no, we're not going to keep those power plants online. These are pretty impressive feats, though, when you think about it. When it comes to support for Ukraine, Germany was initially, despite Scholz's speech, pretty cautious about sending weapons to Ukraine. Germany has been reluctant throughout its post-war history to send weapons to conflict zones and to be involved in conflict zones. But this has shifted over time, and at this point, Germany is one of the largest weapons exporters to Ukraine. There was a gaffe early on in the war when the former defense minister talked about delivering 5,000 helmets. I don't know how many of you heard about that, right? But it was something that caused a lot of laughter. How seriously is Germany going to be taken if all they're going to do is deliver 5,000 helmets to Ukraine? But since then, it's really stepped it up and provided anti-aircraft tanks, self-propelled howitzers, rocket launchers, air defense systems. More recently, Germany has committed sending infantry fighting vehicles and is working with its European allies and with the US to send 2 battalions of heavy battle tanks to Ukraine. There is a lot of consternation about how long it's taking to get all of that equipment into the field, but from all accounts, Germany is moving forward, and over the summer, even announced another major arms package to provide more tanks, more armored vehicles, and more air defense systems. And this commitment altogether makes Germany the second largest supplier of financial aid, but also military aid to Ukraine after the United States, and the largest contributor of support from Europe. In addition, Germany has trained thousands of Ukrainian soldiers, and there's no doubt that the equipment, the training, is making a difference on the battlefield. But each decision has sort of taken a lot of time. And those of you who have been following Germany in the press have probably seen that there's been some waffling And it's almost been painful to see how long it's taken Berlin to make some of these decisions, to the point where some have even asked whether too little is being provided and whether it's too late, because it's unclear whether the equipment will actually help Ukraine, will help Kiev have a decisive victory on the battlefield. And what's been truly fascinating as a Germany watcher is even Chancellor Scholz has been reluctant to say Ukraine has to win. He's talked a lot about being supporter for as long as it takes, but this notion of winning and losing is not something that's really made it into his vocabulary. In addition to the military support, the other way in which Germany has really been providing a tremendous amount of support to Ukraine has been in taking refugees from Ukraine. Well over 1 million refugees have come from Ukraine since the beginning of the war. Most of them are women and children. It's been relatively easy, by all accounts, to integrate the Ukrainians into German society. The labor market has accommodated them more smoothly than during other previous refugee crises. And that number of 1 million is probably a low number because it's actually been possible for a lot of people from Ukraine to come to Germany without registering through formal processes, but just visiting family and friends, and so the numbers are probably much higher. In terms of NATO and the Bundeswehr, the German military, the appointment of a new defense minister, a guy named Boris Pistorius, relatively recently, has really been critical in sort of shifting the perspective of Germany's defense. He's taken the task of modernizing the Bundeswehr very seriously. He's been a strong advocate of providing military support to Ukraine, sometimes an even stronger advocate of that than his boss, Olaf Scholz. And upgrading and modernizing the Bundeswehr includes everything from making sure that soldiers have modern radios, because the radio systems they've been using have been from the 1980s. But it also has to do with having new tanks and new fighter jets. As part of Olaf Scholz's speech in late February, he talked about a 100 billion euro special fund to help modernize the Bundeswehr. And there's been some real criticism about the fact that it's been hard to see any of this money being spent. And it's taken a very long time to see that financial commitment. According to some people that have spoken within the defense ministry at this point, or as of the summer, just over 40% of that 100 billion euros was contracted, was under contract. And by the end of the year, 80% of that 100 billion will be under contract. The explanation was, look, it's not like you go to the supermarket and just fill your cart, right? You need to go and figure out what you need and who can provide it, and it takes some time to produce it. And who pays for that up front? You pay for it when you get the goods. And so he was kind of just calm down. We are getting there, and by the end of this year, just over 80% of that 100 billion will have been spent. Some of the other officials that I've spoken with in the Ministry of Defense have also pointed out that they are especially pleased that Germany will be purchasing 35 F-35s to replace its almost defunct Tornado fighter jets, as well as 60 Chinook helicopters. And these purchases are coming from the United States, and so they see this as a strong signal of a really strong German-American alliance in a way in which we can work together. German government officials have also said, and this has been a sticking point in recent years, that Germany will meet its 2% of GDP expense on defense, and this is above and beyond the 100 billion euro next year. This was a promise that was made, or a commitment that was made in 2014 at a NATO summit, and countries were given a 10-year timeline to meet that 2% hurdle. And Germany plans to meet it next year, and the government, regardless of which party one belongs to, is incredibly committed to making sure that happens. I then wanted to talk a little bit about relations with Russia. because some of you have probably heard about the fact that that there are some people in Germany who feel an allegiance to Russia, an alliance to Russia, despite the war in Ukraine. But I think it's really fair to say that the war in Ukraine has brought a fundamental, a groundbreaking shift in Germany's Russia policy. For decades, Germany's position on Russia was shaped by something called Ostpolitik, or Eastern policy. It was shaped through the notion of change through trade, or Wandel durch Handel. And the premise of these policies was that by bringing Russia closer to Europe would lead to a greater integration, it would lead to greater stability, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine has completely shattered those beliefs. The invasion clearly demonstrated that Ostpolitik was at worst naive, at best no longer relevant and no longer applicable in the 21st century. And what I find sort of truly remarkable about this is that Ostpolitik was largely shaped by social democrats like Willy Brandt, and we now have a social democrat as the chancellor, but sort of more importantly, the general secretary of the party is a guy named Lars Klingbeil, who's in his 40s, and he has been very outspoken that this fundamental tenet of German and social democrat foreign policy is not suitable anymore for today's geopolitical environment. Germany and its economy certainly benefited from inexpensive Russian energy for decades, but it became too dependent on Russia and has learned the difficult lesson as it tries to wean itself off of Russian energy. And one of the questions that I found myself asking many of our visitors from Germany was, the relationship between Germany and Russia was pretty simple, right? It was hard currency for energy. Germany has similar dependencies with China, where the relationship is much more complicated. To what degree is one drawing lessons from the situation with Russia when it comes to Germany's China policy? And there were some politicians who said, we're not even thinking about that at all yet. There were others who said, of course we're thinking about it. In the meantime, Germany has a China policy that takes some of that into consideration, but there's recognition that being overly dependent on another country has significant disadvantages. So what's the framework for this new sort of foreign and security policy? In addition to this groundbreaking speech that Olaf Scholz held, there are several documents that provide some interesting insights into the contours of German foreign policy. And all of them, interestingly enough, have their origin in the coalition agreement, in the coalition document that was crafted before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but they really need to be considered against the backdrop of the war that is unfolding. Each of these documents was released in the last year, and I just want to take them very briefly in chronological order. In early March, the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock presented the guidelines for something called a new feminist foreign policy. And this foreign policy, which basically dominates much of Germany's international outlook, seeks to make gender equity and women's rights a central objective in all of Germany's external relations. And at the same time, the development minister, the Minister of Economic Cooperation and Development, named Svenja Schulze, announced a new strategy that also focused on feminist development assistance. And if you dig into this sort of feminist foreign policy, you'll see that, as was outlined in the coalition agreement, the focus is on a values-based foreign policy with democratic principles, the rule of law, human rights at its core. And I actually wish that the German government had said, we want a holistic foreign policy rather than a feminist foreign policy. But perhaps having two women as ministers contributed to putting women front and center. But what I found in our work is that as soon as we put gender or feminism in the title of an event, half the people won't show up, and those are the people that you're trying to reach. And if you were to talk about a holistic foreign policy that is values-based and not always interest-based, then maybe you could make that case to a wider group. Earlier this summer, in mid-June, the government released a much anticipated national security strategy. This was a document that had been expected to be released months earlier, and it basically centers on making Germany's security policy, quote, robust, resilient, and sustainable. And it includes elements of the feminist foreign policy, but it also includes a focus on things like climate change and security policy. And in this national security document, it even goes so far as to describe Russia as, quote, the biggest threat to peace and stability in the Euro-Atlantic region. So it really puts Russia front and center when it comes to Germany's security concerns. This security strategy was a first for post-war Germany. It emphasizes the relationship that Germany has with the European Union, with NATO, but also bilateral relationships with Paris, with Washington, D.C., and in this document, it reaffirms Germany's commitment to meet its 2% spending pledge. A month after the national security strategy was released, the government released a 64-page China strategy, which basically focuses on reducing dependence on China. There's discussion about de-risking the relationship with China, and this is defined in the strategy as reducing dependencies in critical areas, keeping geopolitical aspects in mind when taking economic decisions, and increasing our resilience. So again, the word resilience sort of comes up over and over again in these policies. What's interesting, though, in these strategies is they do a great job of highlighting the current situation, but they fall short in having actual policy prescriptions about what Germany should do next. So it's a great analysis of where we are and what the risks are, but does not go far enough in terms of how it implements the strategy. And there are big questions, too, about whether the German government even has the money to implement these kinds of strategies and the measures that need to be taken. In a conversation with some people in the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defense, they said, we now have the framework, that's yet to come. Bear with us, give us some time. But it seems clear that particularly when it comes to China, Germany, together with other EU member states and even the US, need to reduce dependencies on China, strengthen the resilience of supply chains in light of how vulnerable they can be and how vulnerable one can be if one's too dependent on another country. So, you know, when I was saying that there was little sort of tangible in terms of recommendations in these policies, one of the things that I come back to is there was a debate about whether Germany should have a national security council like we have in the United States. And it would have been ideal to mention that in the national security strategy. But there's no sort of outline for the creation of an institutional body that would oversee and implement the strategy. Interestingly enough, the strategy also does not emphasize or highlight Germany's role on the world stage, and it actually avoids the term leadership. So, you know, while I started by saying Germany has made a lot of progress, it still seems to be very reluctant to take on a leadership role and even to recognize and be outspoken about the fact that it has national interests. Let me maybe sort of start to wrap up by trying to bring a couple of these threads together. I think it's clear to everybody who's here that the war in Ukraine has been a tectonic shift, and that it's clear that Europe's security architecture needs a major overhaul. As part of that, it's clear that Germany, as a leader in Europe, needs to step up and take on more of a role when it comes to security and defense. And this is particularly true when you see what's going on in parts of Eastern Europe, when you talk with people from Eastern Europe. These are countries that, to some degree, rely on or look to Germany for leadership, and have been frustrated by the fact that Germany has been waffling on things, has been slow to take action, and even that its action sometimes has been somewhat limited. So one certain recommendation for Berlin is that it shores up its relationships with Central and Eastern European countries, with the Baltics, with the Nordic states as well. And that's something that has been slowly moving in the right direction, but very, very slowly. Germany's size, its location in the center of Europe, its institutional connectedness in Brussels, its economic might, all make it a very important player in Europe and around the world. And yet, largely due to its history, throughout the post-war period, Germany has been reluctant to accept or even embrace what this means, and has really held back. And it seems as if a time has come where Berlin needs to come to terms with its status and its role within a new European, transatlantic, but also international security framework. It needs to position itself as a leader and as a reliable partner, both today but also moving forward in the future. And as I said before, Chancellor Scholz has said that Germany will help Ukraine for as long as it takes, but we have yet to hear a definition of what that means. How long is as long as it takes, and what would success look like? At home, he continues to need to make the argument for why Ukraine matters and that more is at stake than just the implications inside of Ukraine, but really beyond Ukraine's borders as well. And this is kind of a rude awakening for many Germans. In the post-war era, Germans could assume that the world around them was peaceful, and that economic interdependency was a solution to their problems because it provided stability, it provided reliance on one another. But this war has shown that that's over. And obviously with an election on the horizon here in the U.S., it seems almost irrelevant whether Joe Biden stays in office or whether someone else gets elected. Germany is at a point where it needs to demonstrate that it can take decisive action. It needs to start building its own capabilities, not as a counterweight to the U.S., but in the context of some of the shared goals that the U.S. and Germany and Europe overall have. I would sort of tend to give Germany a B+ in terms of where it is. It's truly done a lot over the last 18 months in terms of successfully weaning itself off of Russian energy, providing military support to Ukraine, absorbing refugees from Ukraine, and it has demonstrated that it can get things done when it needs to. Right now, as Scholz and his colleagues in the government enter the second half of their term in office, I think the clock is really ticking, not just for Ukraine and this war of attrition that we're seeing unfold, but really for Germany, for its future, and the future of the Chancellor and his government. The next year, I think, is going to be very decisive for the coalition government, and it's an opportunity for him to show some leadership, both at home and abroad. And so I guess my last line would be that in the spirit of the Zeitenwende, right, the fundamental shift, Germany is not the country it used to be, but it's not yet the country that it needs to be. So let me stop there and take questions about foreign policy and also about domestic policy. Scott, do you want to start and break the ice asking a question? Or are you ready?
Karen? Without my- Well, Steve, you invited me to ask the first question, and that was not planned. But you snuck up on the 800-pound gorilla in the room, or whatever the phrase is. At the end, how concerned is Germany about the 2024 election? Depending on how it goes, is that in itself a determinant to what Germany does?
So there's a great German word called Jein, which combines ja and nein, so yes and no, right? So to your first question, there's a lot of concern in Germany about the next U.S. election. And I can confidently say, if it's not the first question that's asked by any of the people in Germany that I'm talking to, it's certainly the last or second to last question that I get asked of how this election is going to go, and whether Donald Trump could really become the president of the United States again. So there's a lot of concern. What's also really impressive, though, is how closely even your average Germans are following U.S. politics, and not just at the national level in terms of knowing who the Republican candidates are, but really at the subnational level as well, watching state races as well. So yes, there's a lot of concern about what might happen next, and much in the way that I said, there are questions about Germany's reliability as a partner. Many Germans question how reliable a partner the U.S. will be moving forward. The Jein part comes in where it's sort of, what does that mean and what do they do? And I think the jury is sort of out on that. I think that a re-election of Trump would maybe serve as a catalyst for Germany to take on some of these leadership roles that I was talking about. But in a sense, that might almost come a little late. Because just as we're wrapping up our election, the Germans are going to be focused on their election, which is in the fall of 2025. And traditionally, when you have a coalition government, they do a really good job through this coalition agreement of working together for the first 2, maybe 3 years, because they've got this work plan, they've got this agenda where they're ticking off the things that they need to get done that they've agreed to. But it's in that year before the next election that the parties have to differentiate themselves from each other and develop their own contours so that they're not seen as part of that government. And I think that that would be even more the case this time around. So I see a lot of sort of internal navel gazing as we're coming out of our election and the Germans are going into theirs. So. And let me just say to the students, at least one of you wants to ask a question before we leave.
Yeah, I'll make sure that they do that, because I've got them over here. Yeah. The main battle tanks, the Leopards, has the Bundeswehr actually sent theirs, or are they getting the Danes or the Dutch to do that?
So they've started. They haven't sent all of them, but they've started.
But how many do you think are going to go?
There was supposed to be the 2 battalions.
Right.
Supposed to go all together.
Now that doesn't include troops, so that just includes the vehicles.
That's right.
Right.
That's correct. As I mentioned, Germany has been training Ukrainian soldiers.
Right.
And those soldiers are supposedly also soldiers who will be able to use the Leopard tanks.
Yeah.
I want to say that 18 German, I'd have to look at what the number is, but that 18 German tanks have already been deployed.
Right.
But there's real concern that now as the weather is going to start to get worse, and the ground is going to start to get soggy, that even having the equipment is not going to be that helpful.
Right.
And this is where it comes back to this just question of, okay, Germany ultimately made the right decision with U.S. backing, right? I don't think that Schultz would have sent the Leopard tanks if the U.S. had not said that we would send some Abrams as well. That it's coming too late.
Yeah.
Because it's not going to be.
Yes, I was kind of hoping that with this big Ukrainian counteroffensive that's been touted so much, that the Leopards would form, the spearhead, the wedge.
Right.
And they would do a mini blitzkrieg, against the Russians, but that didn't happen at all.
No,
Yeah,
It hasn't happened at all.
do you think that if enough tanks get there, that that'll happen at some point?
I think it's going to depend on a lot of factors. And this guy was just saying, a lot of the area has been mined, so that's
Right.
one of the issues that's come up. There are real concerns about the weather
Yeah,
and to
yeah,
what
it won't happen till the next year. Yeah.
quite probably, and,
Yeah.
and that's where I think leads to a debate about in whose best interest is it to keep drawing out the war. Right now, it seems like it's very much a war of attrition.
Yeah.
We all know about frozen conflicts elsewhere in the former Soviet space, and I guess my concern is that this is going to continue as sort of a hot frozen conflict,
Yeah.
because the fighting will continue, but there's going to be very little that is actually happening to resolve it.
Yeah, I got one more question here, real quick. In light of the World War II occupation of Poland, for instance, or some of the other Eastern European countries, are there certain countries that will absolutely not allow German soldiers to enter?
I think one of the real breakthroughs is that Germany is now sending 2 battalions to Lithuania to also help with air defense in the Baltic states.
Uh-huh.
And
What about Poland?
well, there are big tensions between Poland and Germany.
Yeah.
Poland has recently asked for World War II reparations from Germany, and Germany has dismissed that. They've said that reparations have been made already, and that this topic is dealt with. So there are very tense
Yeah.
relations between Poland and Germany right now. I don't know what Poland's position would be on German troops coming to Poland, but my sense is that the Polish military is sort of strong enough that it does not need or want German forces. And I think it would be, it's one thing for Germany to be training Ukrainian soldiers and sending military equipment to Ukraine. It's another thing to talk about German soldiers who would actually be deployed in the region. I think Berlin, much as Washington, is going to do everything it can not to escalate the war.
Okay, well, one of these excellent young people, or several excellent young people here, have questions, so I'll pass the microphone.
Seeing how things have changed with the German-Russian policy with the Ukraine war, do you think Germany would seek to alter relations with China?
So this is kind of the big question, right? To what degree is Germany learning lessons from its Russia policy and its relationship with Russia when it comes to China? The new China strategy, I think, is one sort of piece of the puzzle in terms of how Germany is responding. As I mentioned, there's really a focus on de-risking the relationship with China, which comes back to not being as dependent on China as it was on Russia. So from a political and foreign policy standpoint, the government seems pretty clear about pulling back from China and not getting into the same kind of dependence that Germany had on Russia. The private sector is a whole other matter because so many of Germany's big businesses see a market in China, but also China is a source of many of the products that they need for their own production. And they've been a little bit reluctant to say, we're going to pull back from China. So I think this is kind of part of an evolution. As recently as 5 years ago, we in the US, in some other parts of Europe, we really saw a threat posed by China. Many Germans did not want to recognize that as a threat. I think in light of Germany's experience with its dependence on Russian energy, it's recognizing that China poses a threat as well, but it also poses an economic opportunities because it's an economic market.
Oh, thanks. Would you say that the traffic light coalition has overall like inhibited progress in Germany's foreign policy? Because like the different factions, you said, like they have very different views and focuses on what they want to do.
So it's yes, whether the traffic light coalition has actually impeded progress when it comes to foreign policy. Is that a fair way of recapturing your question? So I think that the traffic light coalition is actually having more problems when it comes to domestic policies than when it comes to foreign policy. And that it has a lot to do with the fact that the smallest member of the coalition government, the Free Democrats, have little in common with the Social Democrats and with the Greens. But they were necessary in order to get the majority in order to form the government. If you look at the coalition agreement, there seemed to be some agreement between these three parties on how to move forward, also in terms of foreign policy. Again, the war in Ukraine was really what sidelined the government in terms of the priorities that it had coming in. And I think across the board, there's agreement in terms of what Germany's position needs to be when it comes to helping Ukraine. But the Free Democrats, who also happen to be responsible for the finance ministry, are concerned about how all of this is going to get paid for, right? Because these are huge numbers that we're talking about. So I actually don't see the coalition as being what has held the government back. Interestingly enough, I think it's actually the chancellor who's been sort of dragging his feet. If you look at some of the other key people in key ministries, they've been far more forward-leaning in terms of having sort of a foreign policy with more teeth.
I was wondering, so this is kind of on the energy side. Do you think that Germany, like I know you said that they moved a lot faster with their energy moving away from Russia with the war? Do you think that they still would have made that move eventually? And do you think they'll still move towards sustainability eventually, even while they're needing to produce their power pretty solely on?
So the question has to do with Germany's dependence on Russian energy and whether Germany would have sort of reduced its Russian energy use, whether it's going to go back to using energy from Russia, and its focus on renewables. So under Angela Merkel, there was lots of discussion about an energy transition and a focus on renewables. And certainly at the American Council on Germany 5 or 6 years ago, we were doing lots and lots of policy discussions about how great it is that there's this German model for an energy transformation that's focused on renewables and on sustainability, only to find that not very much was happening with that. The irony for me is that it took a war in Europe for Germany actually to make more progress on its commitment to focus on renewables and sustainability. I think if the war had not happened, Germany would have continued to take oil and gas from Russia. It would not have weaned itself off of that. There was a big debate about Nord Stream 2, which was a second pipeline from Russia. And it took, we were actually talking about it a little bit last night, that it always struck me as odd that Merkel would talk about Nord Stream 2 as a commercial project and did not seem to see the geopolitical significance of it. And early in his tenure, Olaf Scholz also talked about it as a commercial project and not a geopolitical project. So I think that without the war, Nord Stream 2 would have gone into commission and Germany would have continued to use it. Having said that, after the war, I don't think Germany is going to go back to using Russian energy. I think they've been burned by this once, and they're not going to go back. So if anything, this has kind of instilled in Germany a need to move forward with renewables and with more sustainable development. And then I think there was a question over here too.
So part of Germany has been the economic engine of the EU. I think that's been pretty obvious for quite a few years. And the very heart of their economic engine is the automobile industry. And currently they're dramatically behind even the US in electric car production. And the problem with electric cars, about 50% of the value added is in the batteries. And that all comes from China. Battery manufacturing is very energy intensive and very ugly chemical process. And so it will never be in Germany. Their pollution regulations are going to prevent them from either having cheap electricity or complex chemical processes. So what's that? I mean, if they start choking on their economic engine, I would think it would be a challenge for them.
So I would say that Germany is already choking when it comes to the economy. The automotive industry is one element of that, which I'll say something about in just a second. Germany is dealing with inflation. It's dealing with the high cost of energy. It's dealing with a shortage of skilled labor. There are estimates that within 10 years, Germany will be lacking over 7 million skilled workers in order to keep the economy going. And if I didn't say it, also inflation, right? That the inflationary trends are really affecting the German economy in a very negative way. And so, you might have seen publications like The Economist are starting to ask whether Germany is the sick man of Europe again, and this was a question that was being asked some 20 years ago, because the economy is slowing down. Several economic institutes have said that they see, I think, a 0.3% growth rate in Germany this year and next year, right? So no growth, slow growth. And so there are real concerns about the state of the economy. So it's timely that you asked this question today, because just yesterday, Scholz announced something that he called a Deutschland Pact, or a pact for Germany, which is supposed to help boost the stagnating economy and reduce bureaucracy for German business. So, there is maybe some hope on the horizon there. But I would not say that hope spreads to the German automotive industry. And actually, just this morning, I was looking at a chart, which I can share with you later, that shows just a tremendous drop in automotive orders. By and large, I think one can say that German automobile manufacturers have missed the boat on electric cars. And it's not for a lack of warning. A decade ago, one of the former governors of the state of Baden-Württemberg, who is a Christian Democrat, wrote an article that was kind of a shot across the bow for the German automotive industry, saying lots of changes are on the horizon. And they're changes that we need to be thinking about, given the importance of the automotive industry for our economy. They have things to do, or they have to do with things like the combustion engine is not going to be the engine of the future. Had to do with battery technology. Had to do with software. How much software is now in cars? And it had to do with the materials that would be used to build cars. That there would be fundamental shifts. And it's almost as if very few people in the automotive industry read that article or took it to heart, because Germany has largely missed the electronic car, the electric vehicle trend. So I don't know, what that means. But after we're done, I'll show you this chart, which is really interesting, of just sort of the tremendous drop in orders for German cars, even since as recently as 2019.
Somewhat ancillary question. Germany's creating some significant supply chain issues with this defense equipment going to Ukraine, ammunition, spare parts. Sure. So did the Deutschland Act include any type of, relaxation of current export control, especially to non-NATO and nascent NATO members?
That's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that because I just saw some of the reporting on the Deutschland Pact this morning, and it did not. The reporting that I saw did not mention export controls at all. So I don't know the answer to that. In terms of the cost to Germany of everything that it's doing to support Ukraine, that is definitely having an impact domestically. It's one of the big issues that Scholz had fairly recently was there had been a debate over a standard price for energy for industry, and an industrial price that would be capped at a certain level so that business could plan. And he said no to that. And it had been something that he'd been entertaining as a way of subsidizing those businesses and making sure that they could continue. So his economic policy is also something that leaves something to be desired. Other questions, comments?
We have relatives that are in Eastern Germany, and they were saying that with the Ukrainians coming through, the government is providing welfare, for any Ukrainian that comes across with no work requirement right now. And then actually they're really, I don't know if there's if resentment's too strong of a word, but there is, the population's really noticing that. Plus they're really putting a lot of money into funding language help for these people because they need skilled labor. So they really want them to work there, but that many of the Ukrainians are actually taking the money and sending it back home. And then actually going back home, living in Ukraine, and then coming back and getting welfare, and then going back again. Are you aware of any of that?
So I hadn't heard stories about people coming and leaving and coming back and trying to take advantage of Germany's welfare state. What I have heard is that in comparison with many of the asylum seekers and refugees who came in 2015 and 2016, the Ukrainians who are coming make no illusions about wanting to go home when the war is over. And so on the one hand, it's sort of harder to integrate them into society because they want to leave. On the other hand, in Germany, much has been made of the fact that in previous waves of refugees, it tended to be young men from Muslim countries who it was harder to integrate. And there are mostly women and children coming from Ukraine. And the last I heard, over 200,000 Ukrainian children have been incorporated into the school system and are getting an education despite what's going on at home. And I think that while I have heard stories in Eastern Germany and in other parts of Germany where there is a sense of resentment that people are coming from abroad and able to take advantage of the welfare system, there's also a recognition that these people have to be supported in one way or another and need this. And so it's something where I would say most of the public is behind these investments and these decisions to support the Ukrainians. And the hope is that some of them will actually stay. There's a whole other debate that's going on right now about this skilled labor shortage and the fact that the Traffic Light Coalition is actually reducing some of the guidelines for foreign immigration to fulfill some of these responsibilities. But language training and language ability is kind of at its core. If you don't speak German, it's really hard to work in Germany. And so I think that is something that will undoubtedly continue.
One more question. Our relative is a reporter and was actually going to be interacting with the EU. And she said that when they went to ask questions about, okay, so what is the strategy, as the Ukrainian war continues, like, when would you pull the plug and say that's enough? Or, what's the next step? But there really is none. That's apparent.
At the EU level.
Yeah.
I think both at the EU level and at the national level in Germany, there isn't really a plan because we don't know how it's going to end, right? In some of the conversations that I've been a part of, there's been discussion already now about post-war reconstruction in Ukraine and what does that look like and how is that financed. And there have been some people who are associated with the German Marshall Fund, i.e. the Marshall Plan, right, post-war reconstruction in Germany, what are the lessons that can be drawn from that? And the magnitude of the expense of reconstruction is just so high. There's been some discussion about rebuilding already now, even though the war is still going on, but then running the risk of you rebuild a school or you rebuild a hospital and then it's bombed again. And is that really worth it, right? Don't kind of have to wait until the fighting stops before you start the reconstruction. But I think as long as it drags on, there isn't really a plan for what happens next. Yeah, here's it.
Alternative for Deutschland. What's the prospect of their increased activity, but also particularly increased role, not only in the Bundestag, but in different Länder elections?
So, Sky was asking about the alternative for Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland, which is a populist right-wing political party that made it into the Bundestag in the 2017 election and was actually the largest opposition party that first period that it was in government that it was in the Bundestag, because the government was a grand coalition of the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, and they were the largest party with 12% of the vote. They're not the largest opposition party now because of the Traffic Light Coalition. The Christian Democrats are the largest party. But we're seeing, and I alluded to this earlier, sort of a little bit of a splintering of the German political landscape. For much of Germany's post-war history, you could look at the two catch-all parties, the two Volksparteien, the Social Democrats that are slightly left of center, the Christian Democrats that are slightly right of center, and they would have anywhere between 80 and 90% of the vote, and sometimes needed another party, whether it was the Free Democrats or the Greens as a kingmaker. Often they formed government together. But now, the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats would hardly make 50% of the vote, right? So they've lost traction to some of these other parties. And what's very disconcerting about the Alternative for Germany is they are now polling above the Social Democrats. The party, in every Sunday, there's a Sunday question. If elections were today, who would you vote for? And the most recent Sunday poll had the Christian Democrats at 27%, the Alternative for Germany at 21%, and the Social Democrats at 18%. The Greens were at pretty consistently at 14-15% and have been. The Free Democrats at 6 or 7%, but the Social Democrats have been losing traction, and the AfD has been gaining traction. There are 2 state elections in Germany, in Bavaria and Hessen, in a couple of weeks, in the beginning of October. It's doubtful that the AfD is going to play much of a role in those elections in the West, but in the former East, in 3 eastern states, there are elections early next year. And in some areas in the East, the Alternative for Germany is polling at 30%. It's not clear whether these numbers are sort of protest votes or protest voices against the current government, and whether people would do something differently on election day. But there is real concern that the AfD is growing in support. This also comes at a time when more and more people are questioning democratic institutions and practices, and questioning parties. Over the summer, there was a survey that was conducted where 90% of those asked said that they believe that democratic values, right? Democracy is important to them. But over 50 of them said that they are losing confidence in, losing trust in democracy in Germany, and that's up from 30% 2 years ago. And interestingly enough, only 9% said that they trusted the political parties, and that's down from 20% 2 years ago and 30% 4 years ago. So you're much in the way as we talk about internal and external challenges to democracy in the US, this is an issue in Germany as well.
Thank you for your remarks. I want to echo what Sky said about the American who knows more about stuff, and shout out to you and a plug for your work with the Carnegie Endowment, your commentaries and fortune that we've been catching up with. You really are right on the target for what's happening over there. I'm curious about the relationship of Germany with Saudi Arabia. Any comment?
That sort of opens another can of worms. I'll admit it's not a relationship I've followed very, very closely, but in the context of energy and in the shift away from Russian oil and gas, there has been a pivot toward Saudi Arabia and Qatar as sources for German energy, or potential sources. And so one of the questions that's been asked in the public and in the media is, are you swapping out one non-democratic authoritarian state for others, right? And so this is something that is discussed in Germany of again, not wanting to be dependent on a country that doesn't share your values. So it's a topic of discussion, but I don't know, again, I'm not as on top of bilateral relations between Germany and Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Bobby, and thank Stephen. Stephen, we have a little gift for you.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, it might look familiar. Yes, it's a little paperweight globe. I understand that you used to have those in Pittsburgh. So, is that right? Yeah, well, you brought them. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you very much.
And it's been a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. It's wonderful to have you. So I just want to announce the next program will be September 29th. That will be with Sergio Popovich, and it is entitled The Propaganda Playbook. It's going to be talking about the methods which authoritarian governments use, and that will be at the Family Canyon Brewery on the 3rd floor at 5:30 p.m. There's a flyer on your tables that looks like this that talks, the next two programs. The program after that is, I think, October 26th with Fatime, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce her name, but she is a former member of the Iranian parliament who is now is forming an opposition movement. Also, if you are a member, the next World Affairs Council colleagues meeting we will have Carl Schneider talking to us about Turkey, and that is September 19th. And the next book club meeting is Wednesday, September 13th. So for registration, please check our website. You could also scan these handy QR codes and register that way online. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon.